Bienvenidos a todos y todas a esta
Welcome
segunda
everyone
sesión
to
de
the second session of the cycle of
sesión de esta tarde.
Eco-Utopias, and
Contamos
this
con
afternoon
Kristen
session will
Gotze,
be the one
socióloga,
with
escritora y profesora de
Kristen
estudios de
Gotze,
Europa del Este
who
en
is
la
a
Universidad de
sociologist and
Pensilvania
she studies
y es
Eastern
especialista
Europe
en
in the
explicar cómo vivir
Pennsylvania
las
University, and she
ciudades
has
y las
just published a
sociedades.
book in Spanish
Hemos
called Day-to-Day
elegido esta
Utopias, and we've
entrevista para
chosen it as an
reflexionar en torno
excuse
a lo que
to
ella
think about
plantea en el libro, ¿no? Que es
what
las
she talks
reflexiones
about in
sobre
in the
las
book, which
experiencias
are
utópicas a lo
some
largo de
reflections on
2000
utopian
años,
experiences
seleccionando
during
también
the last
aspectos
2000 years. And she
de la
has
situación
selected a series
reciente
of
con,
experiences, both in the
con la
present
mirada puesta
as
especialmente
well
en
as
reflexionar sobre
the past, thinking always about
aspectos relacionados con compartir los
these
cuidados,
aspects, the aspects of
con los
sharing
recursos
care
y con la vida en
and
comunidad.
resources and life as a
Ella
community. And I
encajaba
think
muy
that
bien con
this is
estilos
an experience that
feministas
really
que
fits
tenemos en
with
el
the thread
ciclo
that we have
bueno,
been
pues
following in this
de
cycle.
Kristen vamos a
So
escuchar
we will
con
have not
Blanca
just
Valdivia,
Kristen,
que es
but we will also
antropóloga,
have Blanca Valdivia, who is an
colectivo
urban
Punto Six,
sociologist. She is part of
que
Punt
nos hace
Six,
pensar
a
los
collective that
desde
rethinks
esta visión
domestic
feminista,
spaces, community, and public
una
spaces
perspectiva feminista,
from a feminist
con Nacho
perspective,
García,
and Nacho
de la
Garcia,
cooperativa
who
Garrua
is
y promotor de
a colleague
iniciativas
from
como
Garrua, and he
de
promotes
la
initiatives such
cooperativa de
as
socios de
the
patios y del espacio
co-housing
compartida
experience and
en
the
El Arenero. La idea de la
co-parenting
sesión de hoy es
experience, so in El Arenero,
un buen
so the
diálogo entre
sandbox.
distintos
And we want to have a
temas
dialogue.
para
We want
arrancar,
to
¿no? Haciendo unas primeras preguntas a Kristen,
try
un poco en torno
and
al
start
contexto
by asking Kristen a
de la
few questions
investigación,
so
¿no? Que ha
that she can set
realizado
the
y el
context
contexto
of
que
the
ha llevado a
research that she
escribir
has
este
carried
libro
out and the
y luego
process
lo
that led
planteamos
her
en
to
diálogo
writing this
a
book.
todas
And then we
ellas,
will
¿no?
have a
Cómo
dialogue with
reflexionan
some initiatives that could have very
sobre
well
todo este
fit
libro, que nos
within
van a
the book
presentar
itself that Blanca and Nacho are going to be shared. So, are going to be sharing, sorry. So we will have a dialogue, a conversation, then we'll have some space to answer to the questions that you might have asked via the chat that we will be reading to our guests.
la idea es esto, pues tenemos una
And
hora y
that's the
media,
idea. So we have 1.5 hours
para los que tenemos
because
traducción
we
simultánea,
have simultaneous
elegir el
translation.
idioma en el que
You can
escucháis,
actually choose the language
desde
that you
fuera,
will be
podéis
listening to.
escuchar
If you
a
have a
Kristen
very good English
en el
level,
idioma
you can
nativo,
always listen to
y si
Kristen in
queréis
English.
os podéis poner
And if you think that you
si
might
queréis
be
captar todos los detalles,
um,
podéis poneros
not understanding certain nuances or details, you can always choose Spanish on the globe icon in the bottom side of your Zoom screen and listen to the Spanish version of it. So with no further ado, we will start this session. So Kristen, the first question has to do actually with inviting you to share, really, what has led you to research these utopias, these day-to-day utopias along the history, but also in different geographies and in the present as well. What was the motivation behind this? What were some of the findings, the most striking findings that you have found along this adventure?
All right. So first of all, thank you very much for this lovely invitation and giving me the opportunity to speak about Everyday Utopia. I think that the story of this book really begins with my last book, which I believe is also translated into Spanish, Why Women Have Better Sex Under Socialism and Other Arguments for Economic Independence. And that book was really a way of looking at the role that governments and states and laws and certain kind of structures in society can play in helping alleviate some of the crisis of care that we have in the 21st century. Care for the young, care for the elderly, care for the ill and infirm. And that book, quite surprisingly, was translated into 15 different languages. And it meant that I have spent the last 5 years really kind of traveling around to different cities and different countries, talking to people about these sort of more socialistic, state oriented policies. And one of the questions that I kept getting, and which really started changing my way of thinking about these sort of larger societal questions, was what happens if the state doesn't want to help us? What happens if we have states that are unresponsive to citizen demands? You know, what if you're living in a state where you hate your government or your government is very conservative? What can we do to still find and pursue progressive change in our societies? And so I was already starting to think about, wow, what are these other pathways? And I have some colleagues and comrades who are anarchists. And of course, anarchists are always very suspicious of the state. And they always want to talk about prefigurative politics, this idea that you can and should live in the world today the way you think the world should be in the future. You should live the way you think, as if the world that you want to see already exists. And I think that's a really powerful and important idea. So I was already starting to think about this when the pandemic hit. And during that first 6 months of lockdown, in fact, I was supposed to be coming to Spain in May of 2020 to do a little book tour in Madrid and Valencia and Barcelona, and everything was canceled and I was stuck at home. And so I started reading, as I'm a professor, and my happy place is often in books. And I started reading and thinking about all of these different ways that people have tried to change the world without using the state, without using the democratic process, with just using their own communities and their own ideas and their own personal lives as the place of experimentation. And that's what really led me down this kind of rabbit hole of utopian imagination. And I was shocked, really, to discover that people like Pythagoras, 2,500 years ago, when he's leaving mainland Greece to settle in Crotone in what is today southern Italy, he was enacting a very utopian imagining of social change. Get the people that you love, get the people that you want to interact with, and leave and do something different and create something different. Create the world that you want to see in the world that exists. And to me, that was a really inspiring moment. And especially at that time during the early pandemic, when everybody was really isolated and suffering, and people were having a real crisis of care in terms of caring for their children. Schools were closed, daycares were closed. It struck me that in moments of great social upheaval, when the world suddenly changes radically because of some exogenous shock, whether it's a pandemic or a war or an economic catastrophe or a natural disaster, people suddenly open their minds to new ways of being in the world, because the ordinary status quo, the day-to-day that they're used to, has been shaken up. It's been altered in some way. And so that's when utopian ideas become the most important. And I actually believe that we are living, it doesn't feel like it right now, but we're living in a moment where I think utopia and utopianism is ascendant because of the disruptions of the pandemic. And so this book was an attempt to recognize the importance of utopia and utopian thinking for human survival, historically speaking, as well as in the future, and to kind of give a deeper history to this utopian impulse. The importance of having utopian dreams is that utopians and utopian ways of thinking, they're the ones that actually lead us into the future. They're the ones that allow us to survive. And so, this is a somewhat historical, somewhat intellectual project, but it's also a project that's motivated by hope and by optimism that the world that we live in today is not the only world that's possible.
Una segunda pregunta, Kristen.
So a second question, Kristen, so that we can frame the context of this dialogue would be, what do these experiences give us after this whole research and reflection process that you went through to write this book? So these findings, because you have introduced the eco-social crisis that is impacting all of the social, economical, political dimensions. So what does Utopia have to tell us? I mean, what are the inspiring elements that you found in this constellation of experiences that you researched?
Yeah, this is a great question. So one of the things that was really fascinating to me is that whether I was looking in the present day or in antiquity, whether I was looking in Europe or Asia or Latin America, whether I was looking at secular communities or spiritual communities, there seemed to be a very common set of ideas and practices that unite these utopian experiences. And those ideas and practices are kind of the opposite of the way that many people in the modern world, in Europe, in the United States, North America today, believe is a successful way of being in the world. So in the West, in the global North, we have this idea of exclusive biparental care for our own biological offspring in our single family home, surrounded by lots of our privately owned stuff. And when you look at these different utopian experiments, no matter where they are and no matter what historical era, one thing that they all have in common is that people are living in broader groups that are not necessarily blood related. So they're living together in wider communities. They're raising their children more collectively, which from an evolutionary anthropological point of view is more natural. We are historically, evolutionarily cooperative breeders. We have raised our children with many other adults in the past. Our single family ideal is a very recent vintage. People are also living in physical spaces that are not boxed off from each other. They're much more connected architecturally. And again, this is not just, co-housing experiments, co-living experiments, or kibbutzim in Israel. These are also monastic cloisters and beguinages, convents, ashrams, religious spaces where people are living together in wider non-blood related groups, and they're also sharing their resources. And I think the fascinating thing about this way of living, this constellation of ideas of living together and sharing our resources, sharing our emotions, sharing our children, is that it actually really addresses some of the most important crises that we are facing in the 21st century. I think the first among those crises is the climate crisis, the ecological catastrophe that is sort of staring us down in the face in the next couple of decades. By sharing our resources, by sharing our housing, by sharing our communities more broadly, we are all individually reducing our ecological footprints. But also, we're dealing with the pandemic of loneliness and isolation, which many people suffer from. We're dealing with the crisis of care of children, of the elderly, as I mentioned. Bringing elderly people living multi-generationally really deals directly with the crisis of loneliness. The crisis of inequality is another really big question that we have to address. Many of our societies are getting increasingly unequal, and the nuclear family is the thing. It is the unit in society that facilitates the intergenerational transfer of wealth and privilege, largely from fathers to their legitimate children. And so if we want to deal with inequality, we absolutely have to deal with this idea of the nuclear family as a place where wealth is transferred from one generation to the next. And finally, something that I've been thinking about recently is automation and artificial intelligence. It seems that in the future, it may be that a lot of us are not going to have jobs. There are going to be a lot fewer ways to make a living. And so we also have to think about what the world is going to look like, what we want our communities to look like in the absence of the sort of traditional political economies that we've grown up in and that we are expecting will continue into the future. If the pandemic taught us anything, it's that the world can radically change very quickly, and that we have to be prepared to think creatively, flexibly, and adaptively in order to deal with those changes that are coming at us. So I think that these utopian ideas, these practices of sharing housing, of sharing living with a wider group of people, of sharing a love and attention and affection with a greater group of people, of raising children collectively. All of these things are ways, they're technologies that human beings have been implementing for 2,500 years quite successfully, and that we could learn from these things as a way of thinking creatively about how we're going to inhabit this planet in the future.
Muchas gracias, Kristen.
Thank you so much, Kristen. I don't know who would like to take the floor now. Nacho, Blanca, who would like to take the floor?
Muchísimas gracias,
Well,
Kois.
thank you so much, Kois, and thank you so much for inviting me to this event. I actually have lots of questions. I have a series of questions that I would like to ask Kristen and all of you. The two initiatives that have led me here, one of them has to do with that intent of creating an intentional community beyond the traditional social organization systems that Kristen was referring to, that goes beyond blood families and that goes beyond the way in which we're used to working with this idea of couple, children in a private space. So in Entre Patios, we have created this intentional community that is trying to achieve this model of collective life, but which is actually disruptive when compared with the existing models, but it is still something that can be understood. It's not breaking 100% with what we have. It's like trying to have something feasible, something that can happen, can live in the city, something that other people would want as well. And then we have the co-parenting project. And these two projects arose at the same time in parallel. And actually, it was very interesting to listen to Kristen, because these two models are born from the need of having them exist. We were a series of friends who did not have the capacity to buy a house. We could not rent big homes either, and we were expelled from the housing system, and we did not want to have a private house. And when we are not very, very young, so the first time we tried to do it, we were very young. We were very utopic. We lived in the utopia. We didn't have any resources, and we thought that the state should help us. We thought that the state is the one that should guarantee the housing, or we actually demanded for the state to give us that housing, and we were not successful in Madrid. But 15 years later, we tried again. We were still young, but not as young, and we did have some savings. So we started exploring these possibilities. So we wanted the state to do it, but at the same time, we had resources to try and be self-promoters. So we started changing the situation so that we could have self-managed projects. So these were private initiatives. We did it without the state. They were self-managed, and that is how we started with housing. And at the same time, while setting up that project, we started having kids, and we realized that we did not fit in the model either. We could not get public schools, and the private ones were too expensive, and that was not the model that we wanted. It was not the alternative we were looking for. So we decided to do it all together. We were 6 families. We started co-parenting, where the person that we hired and it is a person who we wanted to be a part of the community. It was a friend whom we wanted in Madrid with us, and we started with a house. And 11 years later, that thing that started as something that we needed, just a need, has become a political project. And around 80 families have already gone through this project, and we have, from a need, which was co-parenting, we have generated a model that is not yet something that can be 100% replicated, but it is a model that allows us to reflect, to experiment, an idea. It's like a lab that we can work with, and we combine part of the outsourced care, because we have educators who have been hired by us. They are hired by us, but the families also participate. They also participate in this space with all the kids, with all the children, and we somehow, all of the children share their space with a different family every day. So that creates a fabric, social fabric, and lots of bonds. So families who don't have any support in Madrid, they finally find their tribe, a sort of intentional family, a family that is not blood family. There are no blood ties, but we share parenting together. And that grew, and we set up a co-working that is linked to that. Actually, I am in a co-working, which is on the upper floor, and below me, there's a co-parenting space. So we try to combine that. So you leave your kid there, then you go up and work, and then you go down and you read a story, and then there is another family bringing the food for the kids. So you share all of those things, and it is all linked to that space, to that co-parenting space and co-working space. So in a subtle way, we have created that relationship, that link between the professional life and the care that is provided to the kids. So that was something that we created because of a need. So it took us about 10 years. That is very similar to what Blanca has. She has a very similar space. And the building where we are, we have this idea of not having private property. So what we have is not ours. We have been given the use of the building, and the building was born by trying to face those crises that Kristen has talked about. There was loneliness, care, and then the social crisis. And we wanted for the building to answer to those three crises, and then the climate as well, climate crisis, because it's a very efficient building. So it's paradoxical, because if you have the financing to start up, we who were families with social capital, that was quite high, although economically, at least my salary is quite lower than that of many of the families who are in the public school that we are, but we pay less. What we pay to sustain this investment in this building is less than what other people pay. For instance, heating and so on, we pay less because we invested on it. So from a climate perspective, if we all did this, if this present that we are currently living is actually the reflection of the future that we want, and if people were to do that, then everyone would pay less. And then the social dimension as well, because there's 17 housings at a smaller scale. So there's 50 something people if we consider adults and children. And this has happened naturally. I mean, the children of everyone belong to everyone. I mean, they don't belong to everyone, but the doors are open. Children go up and down. I'm here because my children are being cared for by a neighbor whose kids I cared for yesterday. So the kids see that as a large family, and sometimes they find it difficult to understand that this is not something that happens everywhere. They think that everyone goes through the same thing. And now the economic part is the right of use. I mean, we are attacking capitalism because you know that private housing is at the heart of capitalism, but we have freed a space. We have freed all of this space, and in the long term, I think that there could be a proliferation of spaces such as this one, the one that Blanca has in La Borda, the one that we have, and then there are 30, 40 that are popping up like mushrooms all over the place. So I hope that there will be 2,000 in, I don't know, 10 years' time. So imagine if we were to connect them all and we could all use them all. Once we have amortized the initial investment, we will be generating an economy space as well. So because you have to pay on a monthly basis, but that allows us to strengthen our federalist vision, because we can now go from one place to another and we all belong to the same network, and that would generate resources that could also cover the needs that the state is not covering now, or that will not be able to guarantee in the future, and not just in rural areas but also in urban areas. So I was thinking that this in 10, 15 years could be very, very interesting. My doubt, and this is a question that I'm voicing here, and we could see that later on, the models that we have seen, these examples that we have been given, inspiring examples of how the human beings have organized themselves differently during crises, during natural catastrophes, or during the pandemic. I do see that when the status quo is broken in an abrupt way, when there are violent ruptures of status quo, there are cracks in the organization, and then different organizations pop up and there is cooperation. There are many things come out, but that comes as well. So when there is a degradation, when the degradation is progressive, we don't have the same capacity, do we? It has to be a disruptive rupture. So one of the difficulties that we have is actually that you're doing it an environment where people feel that they have really failed. So trying to promote that is complicated. Well, these are some of the thoughts that I have linked to those utopias and to this optimism. Well, that's just to start off. Blanca, would you like to share? And then we will give the floor to Kristen. And maybe you can also ask some provocative questions as well. And then we could have a conversation between all three of you in a natural way. Well, thank you, Kois, for your invitation, and a pleasure to see you, Nacho, again. And thank you, Kristen, for sharing this space with us and for writing this wonderful book. I also agree with the fact that it is very important when facing this narrative of structural failure, to build narratives that will take us to other places and to also recover genealogies. In Catalonia, for instance, where I come from, in 1931, there were 241 cooperatives with 85,000 members, and that's a lot. And to me, this genealogy of cooperatives, the cooperative movement from the beginning of the 20th century, is doubtlessly the origin of what we currently have. I mean, the social economy in Catalonia is quite strong in Catalonia, more than in other places in Spain or in Europe. So that's why I think that it is very important to recover that genealogy. And then referring to the work or the reflections that we have done with our collective, we are a cooperative of urban planners. We are 9 women, and that seems to be a utopia in such a patriarchal society we live in. Well, what we try to do is try and think. We talk a lot about utopia. We're always talking about utopia, other realities, other ways of living. And we talk about the material conditions and the immaterial conditions in which these new scenarios could actually take place. We talk about the space dimension as well. And actually, in the interview and in your book, you actually talk about Alexandra Kollontai and how she talked to Lenin, and she said that first we have to change the private space so that we can also change the public space. And that is one of the starting points of feminist urban planning. We have to break with this dichotomy of public and private spaces, because we know that that is the basis for capitalism, capitalistic cities and patriarchal cities. This idea that women are in the homes doing caring for everyone, and men are in the public space doing productive activities. That is one of the pillars of the way in which our current spaces have been built and the way in which we configure our cities. So that is why for us, our work, which is always participatory with the people in the context, always go through thinking about what are the characteristics and the space conditions so that we can have, for instance, a co-parenting group, or in order to have a small group for community cooking. So we talk about characteristics such as closeness, proximity, for spaces to be accessible, to have the right infrastructures for work-life balance and autonomy, because we have to really give a name to everything that we need. We need to really think about the material conditions in which these experiences can fit so that they can then be replicated in other contexts. So I'm just sharing some ideas without digging deeper into them. And if you want, we can just choose the ones that have interested you most. With regards to space conditions, we always talk about a new urban paradigm, which is the caring city, that talks about the material conditions that this caring city, this utopian city, would have to be built on. Another idea that I thought was very important, thinking about your book, is the economic dimension. Well, many of us who have been anti-capitalists, anarchists, and so on, who have been militant, we are critics against the capitalist system, and that has pushed us away from economy. And we thought that that was a topic that we didn't want to tackle, when actually we should understand how it works, how the economy works at the different scales, micro and macro, so that we can think about other strategies and ways to share it. Because in the end, any experience to me, any utopian experience, or the whole experience really, would have to go through the distribution of resources, a utopian experience that is not anecdotal, that is not segmented, that is not segregated, so that it can really be cross-cutting and so that it can get to different people, different audiences. So to me, resource distribution is actually very, very important. We also have some experiences here, such as the COP57, which is a cooperative for financial services where individuals who are saving money put their savings in this cooperative, and the cooperative will distribute it in social and cooperative projects that need money. So it's not a bank. It's like a common fund, common resistant fund with sustainability criteria, feminist criteria, and so on. So I think that learning the importance of this economic dimension is something that is very, very important. And finally, well, I'm going to be the pessimistic anarchist because I have been an anarchist militant, and we're always the pessimistic, aren't we? In social movements, it's always us. We're always the party poopers. Well, I have to say that, as I was saying at the beginning, it's really important to explain what the successful experiences are. But I also think it's important to do it from a perspective that is not a naive, romantic perspective. So what's really fairest for everyone does not mean that it is the most convenient thing for all of us. So sometimes the fairest thing for the community means that we have to sacrifice certain privileges. So going back to what we were saying previously, when we were talking about the Colombian comrades, I think that we need to build a new definition of well-being, and it has to be a community and collective definition of what it means to live well from a common perspective, not an individual perspective, because the well-being is about not standardizing needs. Because, for instance, when we talk about care, I mean, there will be people who have certain care needs that have to do with early childhood. Others will have it with regards to mental health or with disabilities. It just depends. There is a long etc. And this notion of well-being from the collective and community perspective will be renouncing privileges, and it will also mean sometimes doing things that we don't want to do because, well, and all of us who are in collective spaces, we know that sometimes you don't want to be at an assembly and you would rather be sunbathing on Saturday morning than being in a meeting that will last 4 hours. But you do it because you know that it is necessary so that you can build the foundation for the right development of something that is collective, that will be long lasting and will have continuity. Because for me, one of the main problems of utopia is continuity. They need to be lasting projects, continuous projects. And the last thing that I think is important, aside from continuity, is that the experiences of everyday utopias should help us change structural elements so that it's not just anecdotal. So it's not just my cooperative, my work cooperative, my whatever group. So from the smaller things, we should be able to use them to do a pedagogical activity, to talk about justice so that we can bring about change. And I would like to link that to Nacho's last question with something that is continuous, that is structural, and that is macro. And I'm connecting it with your first question: what happens when the state does not want to provide us with sexual and reproductive rights to us women? But also the other side, because I'm an anarchist, and sometimes I think that we need a legal framework so that the privileges that some of us have, because we live in our own everyday utopias, can then be extended to other people.
Muchas gracias, Blanca. Kristen,
Thank you so much, Blanca. Kristen,
great. Yes,
how
thank
does
you
that
so much.
resounded for you?
Sorry?
And I wanted to know just how that felt when you listened to all of those interventions, what it made you think.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much there, right, to unpack. And obviously the work and the day-to-day reality of building utopia is never easy. And it's never been easy, right? The history of the utopias that I write about in the book, this question of continuity is a really core question because they often meet a lot of resistance from the people who have the greatest benefit from maintaining the status quo. And so whether we're talking about, 9th century Bogomils in Bulgaria and Bosnia, or the Albigensians in southern France, or Beguine nuns in the lowlands of northern Europe, or we're looking at early pre-312 Christians in the Roman Empire who were being mercilessly persecuted because they had these somewhat crazy utopian visions about how the world should work, or the followers of the Buddha. No matter where you are, utopian communities are going to meet a lot of resistance. And I think that that's a big part of the story, in a good way and in a bad way. So the challenge of utopian thinking and utopian ideology is that you have to be willing to make the sacrifices that Blanca was talking about, doing the hard work. But that can also come with baggage, meaning that if it's too hard, people are going to run away, right? And one of the problems with any political movement, any local political movement or large political movement, is that if it becomes too serious, if it becomes too didactic and too demanding, it's not any fun. And the most successful utopian experiments in history are the ones where people find joy in their connection and in their community. They find value in the shared space. It's not just about, oh, I'd rather be on the beach sunbathing rather than in this assembly meeting, but it's that the assembly meeting is producing something that is also not just valuable in the long run, but immediately joyful. And so utopia as an idea can never be a fixed point. It always has to be something that's on the horizon, something that you're moving towards. I would be really disturbed if I heard anybody say, yes, guess what? I live in utopia and it's perfect and I don't want anything to change about it. That's not a good model, right? The world is constantly changing. So our ideals of utopia need to constantly be changing as well. And that's part of what it means to be human. Part of what it means to be human is to be creative, to be adaptive, to be flexible. When we look, for instance, out through the history of humanity, if we look at the evolutionary biology and the evolutionary anthropology of the family, what we see is that family forms change depending on environmental, climatic, geographic, topographic, political, economic circumstances. The ways that we love each other and we raise our children and live in community have always been malleable, flexible, and adaptive to the circumstances within which we find ourselves. And so that's, again, part of my project is to say there's this deeper there's a deeper genealogical history that we need to recover in order to make the experiments that are happening in the present day not just, something that can be, imagined as the fruit of the disruptions of the pandemic, which will disappear once things kind of go back to normal. But instead, they're part of a very long history of human beings trying to do things in creative and, importantly, flexible, imaginative ways. And that brings me to this question of political economy, because I think that there's absolutely a reality that the planet that we are on can no longer sustain capitalism. And for people who have traditionally identified themselves as Marxist or anarchist or communist, there's long been a critique of capitalism that is changing in light of the environmental crisis. I'm thinking here of the work of Kohei Saito in Japan and the idea of degrowth, right? And exactly what Blanca is talking about the sacrifices that we're going to have to make in our modern lives to sustain life in the long term on a planet that is being compromised by human-caused climate change. But what I am really concerned about, and this may speak uniquely to my geographic location in the United States and my professional location as a professor at university, where I deal with every year I'm dealing with a new batch of 18 to 22-year-olds at the university. And I have seen consistently over the last 2 decades that young people, particularly these very young people, like 18 to 22-year-olds, what they call Gen Z, they're becoming very hopeless about the future. They've lost the belief that the world can change. They've lost the ability to imagine that they themselves can be agents in that change. I think what Nacho and Blanca are talking about is really important, because these are examples of communities currently existing in Spain that see themselves as part of projects that allow them agency to create change in the world. But many, many, many people in the world do not feel that agency right now. Many, many young people have lost hope and are despairing. In the United States, where I am, there is a crisis of mental health, of depression, of anxiety among young people. And part of the reason, I mean, there are lots of complicated sociological, psychological reasons, political reasons for this mental health crisis. Part of it has to do with the pandemic. Part of it has to do with technology. Part of it has to do with the world that we happen to be inhabiting right now. But I think a big part of it is that too many of us have been sold the idea that there is no alternative to capitalism, that there is no alternative to the way the world as it exists as it does today. And so all of my academic research, I don't only write books like this, I also write serious scholarly work looking at the lived experience of 20th century state socialism in Eastern Europe, and what happened when those experiments ended, and what happened to those people who lived through those experiments. And one of the things in the West that I think happened after 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell, is that people all over the world lost the ability of social dreaming. There were many more. I think, again, talking about the cooperative movement in Catalonia in the 30s is a great example of this, right? There were all sorts of ways in which there was energy and passion around the idea that the world could be changed through revolutionary political means, through redistributive means, through concerted social, political, economic movements of people coming together to fight those in power and demand justice. And I agree 100% that we have to always maintain a kind of forward momentum on those larger political and economic goals. However, for too many young people today, and I see this in my work and I see this in my classroom, those larger political and economic goals are too distant and too impossible. And so for me to come back to Alexandra Kollontai, who's a real inspiration for me in my work, I do believe that changes in the private sphere, not just destroying the boundary between the public and the private sphere, which is very important, but actually attending to the private sphere, thinking about the ways in which we live our days, day in, day out, the way we relate to our friends, the way we relate to our families, the way we relate to our comrades and colleagues. All of those social relationships are political in their own way. And if we begin to transform those political relationships, even on this very, very, very micro level, I think that those changes can aggregate in really important ways. And I'll give you a very concrete example. So in Spain, in Greece, in South Korea, in Japan, in many of the countries of Eastern Europe, women are not having children, or they're only having one child, and birth rates are falling. And in the long term, this is creating a lot of anxiety among capitalists and among leaders, because our entire economic model is based on a growth model that a shrinking population kind of undermines. And yet nobody, no feminist that I'm aware of, no world leader or guru is standing up and saying, women of the world, do not have children, resist capitalism by closing your wombs. Nobody's saying that. individual women are making individual decisions about their individual lives based on the political, social, and economic realities within which they find themselves. And those decisions, those individual decisions of individual women and individual families, are having huge political and economic consequences in our states and in our planet. And so that's an example of how these individual changes, these personal changes that we're making, sharing, our living spaces, raising our children more collectively with a wider group of non-blood related adults, thinking more capaciously about how we define family, about who we share our emotions and affections and attentions with in non-transactional ways. And I think that's really important. The family, the reason that the family has been so valuable to people, especially to conservatives, is because the family is this place where the market rules don't apply, where you get love and attention and affection outside of a transactional, commodified mode of being. And so I think that precisely this idea of taking this family model, this marketless space, or imagined, obviously the market is always in that space, but we imagine that it's not there, and expanding it to include more people, it has this potential to do really radical political work. And that was where, when Kollontai is arguing with Lenin keeps telling her, look, we have to worry about the economy. We have to win the Civil War. We have all these problems that we have to deal with. We'll worry about the family later. We'll worry about love and human relationships later. It's not important right now. And Kollontai keeps saying, no, you don't understand. If you don't change the human relationships, all of that other stuff won't matter, right? You can't have a revolution in society unless you have a revolution in our private lives. And that insight is one of the insights that I find in every single utopian experiment, whether it's in Asia or Europe or the United States, whether it's the Pythagoreans in antiquity or the Benedictine monasteries in the Middle Ages or contemporary eco-villages and intentional communities today. It's an understanding that this private part of our world is intensely political. And for young people, that's a message that resonates and that makes them feel like they have agency. I sometimes tell my students, they're like, oh, I want to change the world, but I don't think I can do anything to change the world. And I say, well, look, the first thing you could do is call up a friend and go for a walk. Go get a bottle of wine and sit in the park and just hang out and have a conversation. That is step one in changing everything, is changing sometimes the smallest thing. And there's good historical evidence for those small little incremental changes. Now, I agree. Some people will say those small changes can easily be smashed. There's a lack of continuity in these communities. There's always this resistance. And that's where I do think this concept of militant optimism is really important. And I know a lot of anarchists. I'm a big fan of David Graeber. This idea of a committed moral anarchism, a moral outlook that says, I have faith that the future can be better. And I am actively going to work to make that future better. That is, in Graeber's word, in and of itself, an act of great faith, to believe that the future can be changed for the better. And I think that spirit of utopianism, that spirit of militant optimism, that spirit of radical hope, as Ernst Bloch also calls it, it's what we need in order to survive the challenges that we are going to be facing in the decades to come, because we have this massive poly crisis. We have so many challenges facing us today. And for those of us who are engaged and who are politically willing to imagine a different future, it's one set of concerns. But for the vast majority of our compatriots and colleagues and comrades and students and friends who are apathetic, or worse, who are despairing about the future, the number of youth suicides and deaths of despair in the United States right now is really tragic. we have to help them imagine that these little things that they do in their private individual lives make a difference in the long run. Because I think that's step one in getting people to commit to these much larger, much more important, much more structural and sustainable political projects that Blanca and Nacho were talking about. But we have to give them, we've got to get a hook, right? Because otherwise, the world is filled with dystopian narratives of a bleak and horrible future that beats us into accepting the status quo. And it's unhealthy. And I think in the long run, it's doing our societies an incredible amount of damage.
Nacho, Blanca.
Nacho, Blanca.
Cuando te escuchaba, Kristen, no sé, Blanca.
When I was
también tú.
listening to you, Kristen, I don't know if Blanca, you have the same feeling, but everything that we do, I mean, our vital engine, or my vital engine, has a lot to do with that idea of building a present that is as similar as possible to the future I would like to live in. So this idea of your everyday utopia to the maximum essence, how to build my family, my personal relations, everything that you have mentioned. And I've always done it from the deep conviction of the fact that all of those things that I do make me happier. That's the main thing, obviously. It makes my life easier. As a second thing, and we need to generate spaces and reflection spaces, models that will allow to multiply these ideas. But right now, I mean, in these times we live in, I'm sorry, I cannot hear what Nacho is saying. So the dimension of the crisis that we're seeing, because we talk about this crisis, we talk about the ecological crisis, economic crisis, social crisis, is huge, is enormous. We're talking about the end of an era, of a planet that cannot sustain us all. And sometimes I see that the alternatives that we're offering, if you just take a walk with a friend, you're already starting. And if I say that to someone, I say, well, the crisis is horrible. The alternative is to start taking a walk with your friends. And I think that these are two narratives that clash against each other, don't they? So we have the feeling that we need images that go beyond that simple thing. We also need to have a certain scale for our dreams. I was listening to the Catalonian cooperatives story in the 30s. I don't know if going back to the past is what we need to offer for the future. I don't know if that mutualism, trade union, so that we can have health, housing, education. But we have to offer something more than just everyday utopias that I do believe are fundamental. They're the basis, but we have to offer something something beyond that. If there isn't something more, if I only ask for militant optimism, then it's not enough. We need to have some sort of a foundation. I don't know how you see it, Blanca. It's like the dignity of living as best as we can. That is not enough for most people.
Me sabe mal ser yo la que tenga que ser la optimista en esta
I hate having to be the optimistic here. That's not usually my role. But I wanted to provoke you. That was actually, see, I adapt. Do I have to be the pessimist, the optimist? I'm just, I change along the way. I think that very often we activists and people in cooperatives, we ask for our unique project to solve absolutely all the problems that are structural and that are multiple problems. Because I see the La Borda assemblies, we have economic topics, we have those in our community and beyond our community, and we want to reach everywhere, and that's impossible. You cannot reach everywhere. So I think that, I mean, to me, I like this idea of, I'm sorry, I'm a bit chaotic with my note-taking, but what you were saying about the militant optimism, I think that is also about trusting others. You also have to put your trust in others, and that means that I'm working on this project that will be useful for other people. It will be their inspiration, and it will allow them to build another project that will get further than mine. So it's like our knowledge is not just cumulative. I mean, we are feminist urban planners because some ladies at the end of the 19th century started something else, and the future generations will get further than we did. So I think that this militant optimism is about trusting in others and their capacities as well, and in the future. And I was saying that I'm positive here in this roundtable because, of course, I'm sure we'll remember that when we were militants many years ago, when we had our social fight week in Madrid in the 2004, 2005, a long time ago, we had a commission which was what was it? It was, so that Kristen knows what we're talking about. It was a whole week of social movements in Madrid, and we gathered together to do loads of things together. And there was one day on migration, a day dedicated to food, different topics. And there was one day that was a commission, that was the one I belonged to, which was anti-patriarchal. Because at that time, at the beginning of the 2000s, we ourselves would not define ourselves as feminists. And if you look at it from a different perspective, and you look at it at where feminism has reached from a quantitative and a qualitative point of view in the Spanish state, how it has reached the state level, the political state level, to make it long lasting and to be present in the different organizations and entities and the collectives and the cooperatives, but also in the companies. It is now present in our day-to-day lives, in the day-to-day lives of women and men, because it's not something that has only changed women militants and activists. My nieces, my teenage nieces, they're all feminists, and they know what consent means, and they know how to say no, and they know loads of things that I did not know of when I was their age. And that was thanks to something that started in a residual manner, but that, well, thanks to capillarity in our organization, polluted everything, and it became something massive and cross-cutting, and has become something that I hope will be long-lasting. So all movement, all advance, all progress will obviously take a step backwards at some point. But if you've walked 100 steps and you go back 20, well, you've already advanced 80, haven't you? So you've made progress.
Kristen, ¿alguna cosa?
Do you have something to add, Kristen?
Yeah, I definitely want to second that. I think that we are very presentist beings. We tend to think, obviously the unit of our analysis is a lifetime, because that's what we get. But when we look at the longer history of humanity, and again, I think that there's a beautiful story that is told from evolutionary anthropology and the work of people like David Graeber and David Wengrow in their wonderful book, The Dawn of Everything, that human beings, right, we change, and we've always changed. And in fact, the world has, Martin Luther King very famously said, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And I do think that exactly this idea that 24 years ago, you're arguing about anti-patriarchal politics, and within 20 years, you have a generation of young girls who will identify as feminists. I've been around, a long time, and I can tell you that things that I never thought that I'd see in my lifetime, legal same-sex marriage in the United States, have come to pass because people pushed for them, people fought for them. And yes, I mean, to come back to Nacho's comment about, yeah, the planet is burning, and probably the immediate solution to the big problem is not go take a walk with your friend. It's probably to try to dismantle extractive capitalism and prevent the continued use of fossil fuels. And I agree, as I said, those big goals should never be discounted. But I think for a lot of people, the impenetrability of those goals, the idea that one person can actually make a difference towards getting rid of fossil fuels, for instance, or stopping human-caused climate change, it can be incredibly disempowering to people. And so what I think is so wonderful about what Blanca just said is that being part of utopian spaces, being part of militant spaces, being part of creative communities that are trying to make the world a better place, that in and of itself can be radicalizing. Lenin's wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, wrote a beautiful pamphlet in 1901. She wrote it in 1899 and it was published in 1901. It was called The Woman Worker. And in this pamphlet, she's talking about how Russian women, many of whom were illiterate, Russian women were very apolitical. They felt like they had no power, especially under the Tsar, right? They were very superstitious, they were religious, they were uneducated, and they basically just accepted the status quo. And so what Krupskaya says in this pamphlet, I think is so interesting, is that women become radicalized by participating in marches, demonstrations, and that participating also has this effect of radicalizing. Like a woman may not be radical, but she just needs to show up. She just needs to do the equivalent of go for a walk with the right friend at the right time. And that the experience of collectivity, the experience of community is an incredibly empowering political motivator for people because we're social animals. We come from a long history, evolutionary history of people who survived because they were able to live in community with others. You know, most of the people who went off into the woods to live by themselves, they didn't have many kids and they didn't, you know, we haven't inherited their genetic predispositions to solitude. We are the children of the dreamers. We are the children of the socialites. We are the children of the people who lived in community. And so bringing community is an act of politics. It is this militant optimism, radical hope. What it means is that even though going for a walk with my friend or having a bottle of wine at the park, you know, doesn't seem like in the grand scheme of things, it's going to make a bit of difference in the world. It might actually make all the difference in the world if it's the right friend who has the right connections and the right influence in the future. You know, you don't know. The world history is so contingent. You never know if that one conversation that you shared with one person could be the thing that changes the world. So in science fiction, I'm a big reader and lover of science fiction. There's this idea, it's called the butterfly effect. And this is a classic plot in science fiction novels where there's time travel to the past. So in a science fiction story, if somebody goes to the past, the idea is that you can't step on a butterfly, because if you step on a butterfly, that butterfly might have been the very butterfly that inspired, you know, somebody to create something in the future. And that if you kill that butterfly, the whole future will be totally and completely different, right? That's the butterfly effect. So most people understand this idea in terms of science fiction, like in the past, right? If you change one thing in the past, the future can be different. There's all sorts of episodes of Star Trek that are about this, and Star Wars, and all sorts of different time travel genre films and books and television shows that deal with the butterfly effect. But that means that our present is also contingent, and that the smallest thing, the butterfly that I see outside right now, could be the very butterfly that changes the world in some way because it inspires somebody to make some technology that reverses climate change, right? That is a kind of thinking. It's a kind of optimism. It's a kind of hope that isn't just about, oh, just sit back and wait and everything will get better. I'm not talking about positive psychology. I don't believe in positive psychology, but I believe that if you think that the future can be better, and you try to live in the world today as if the future that you want to see is the future that will be, and you're living that way now, every person who does that contributes in a broad way to making that future a reality. And again, this is where history is important, because when we go back and we look at massive moments of social change it's often because there are a group of people who are believing that the world in the future can and will be different. And to me, given everything that is happening in the world right now, the war, the pandemic, the fear that I have of another Trump presidency, all of the rolling back of women's rights that I've seen in the United States, the despair that I see among my students, the suicides that are happening, I feel myself often very despairing about the world that we live in. I'm not an idiot. I see what's happening around and I worry deeply about what's happening. And I want to try to change it. And I want to do what's right for my children, for my students, for my colleagues, my comrades, my friends, my family, everyone around me. And sometimes I don't feel like I have any power to do anything. But the one thing that I do have the power over is whether or not I give up hope that the world can be different. And for me, sometimes just that little political act of continuing to hope in spite of everything terrible that's happening in the world right now is what I need to pick up and go to the next rally, to go to the next assembly meeting, to do the next event, to teach the next class, to try to create the world that I want to see. Because all of us are busy, all of us are tired, all of us are trying to live in a world that is commodifying everything about our love and emotion and attention. It's destroying us. You know, we have these machines that we're looking at that are monetizing our eyeballs all the time. You know, everything about this is seeping into us. It's trying to drain hope and optimism from us. And so sometimes we have to just resist. And resist can mean mounting the barricades, or it can just mean, God damn it, I'm going to go for a walk with my friend. And I'm not going to bring my phone, and I'm going to have a meaningful conversation that brings us closer together and nurtures a human bond independent and outside of the market. Sometimes I think that that in and of itself can also be a really radical act.
Bueno, pues voy a recoger una de las preguntas que han ido mandando por el chat y que conecta.
I'm going to read some of the questions that have been written on the chat that I do have a lot to do with that idea of going for a walk with our friends and how we create a link. And this has to do with the solitude and loneliness epidemic and with our everyday utopia, the link between them, and about whether they're influenced by the fact that rituals are disappearing and group activities are disappearing. And what you just said about the phone and this dynamic of virtualization of social relationships, if that solitude has to do with all of those things.
Yeah, I mean, look, we are the evolutionary children of people who sat around the fire and told each other stories, right? What do human beings do at night? They sit around the fire and they tell each other stories. They talk to each other. That was, you know, that's what we did. And somewhere along the line, you know, we got theater. And when we're in a theater, there are a bunch of people in the audience and there are a bunch of people on stage, and the people on stage are acting or singing or making jokes or whatever, and they're entertaining the people in the audience. And then at some point we got the cinema. And the cinema, you're still in a room with a lot of people, but the people that you're looking at are two-dimensional on a screen, right? So you've taken away the live people that are on the stage and you're just looking at the screen. And then we got television. And instead of going to the cinema, we sit in our homes and we either sit with our families or we sit by ourselves and we watch the television. And now we watch our phones, right? This is what we do, right? TikTok and Instagram and Reels and everything like that. It's completely solitude. So we are people, and in, you know, and many media theorists believe that screens, so like the movies, the theater, the television, it's our virtual fire, right? It's like we like to look at bright things that are flickering. And we used to do that collectively. And now because of capitalism, because of technology, because of the internet and all of these social media apps and YouTube and all these things, the fire that we're looking at is a private fire, and we're doing it by ourselves. And we are not evolved to stare at the fire alone. We're evolved to stare at the fire collectively and to talk and to enjoy each other's company and to create the community that allows us to survive. And so, yes, absolutely, this crisis of loneliness in so many ways, of isolation and solitude, in so many ways, I think it's at the root of much of the political problems that we're having in the world today. I think it explains the slide into the far right, sort of very conservative, almost fascist politics. These politicians are able to weaponize the loneliness, especially of young men. A lot of the misogyny that we see in the world, a lot of the racism and xenophobia has to do with isolation and loneliness, and the ways in which people who are producing conspiracy theories can prey on the fears of people who are alone and are afraid to be alone for the rest of their lives. You know, obviously the climate crisis, like we're all living alone in these little single unit boxes with heating and cooling. And this is incredibly inefficient, right? Again, the ways in which we live are contributing massively to these various different crises that we're having. And there's one other thing that I think is really important to mention. I have a colleague at the University of Pennsylvania. Her name is Malika Sarma, and she's a biological anthropologist. And she does research on human bodies in extreme circumstances. So she works with NASA to look at how human beings exist when they're in zero gravity or on another planet. She works with people at very high altitudes. She looks at people who are dealing with extreme heat or extreme cold. And she also looks at people in areas of the globe where there are high pathogenic loads. So for instance, in the jungle, in the rainforest, where there are a lot of diseases and it's very difficult for human bodies to survive. What she finds, and she takes saliva samples and she measures testosterone and she measures cortisol. And basically what she finds is that when the human body is under extreme physical stress because of changes in the environment, a couple of things happen. One is that cortisol levels increase our metabolisms, which means that we burn calories at a faster rate, which means that as organisms, we're less efficient. Secondly, she finds that our vestibular function is off. So vestibular function is what you need in order to kind of move around the world without hitting things, without bumping into people. So extreme biological stress compromises our efficient use of energy, and it compromises our ability to move in the world. And the one thing that protects against these effects is proximity to other people that you trust. So as the world heats up, as our environment becomes more and more extreme, our bodies are going to be taxed. They're going to struggle to survive in extremes of heat, in extremes of cold, in extremes of zero gravity, in extremes of high altitudes, wherever it is human beings find themselves. The most protective thing that we can do as a species in order to survive, according to my colleague and her research, is have big communities of people that we love and trust. And I think that empirical evidence is unequivocal. And if you combine that with the work of people like my colleague Robert Waldinger in the Harvard Study of Adult Development, which is a longitudinal 70-year study that shows that the most important predictor of happiness in human life is the quality of your relationships. Those two pieces of empirical evidence show us that the most important thing that we all could be doing right now is investing in our relationships, is sharing our time and our emotion and our affection with other people in a much more capacious way. And that is going to help us survive and thrive in the future.
Pues muchas gracias, qué interesante.
Well, that's very interesting. Thank you so much for that answer, Kristen. And we are getting closer to the end. We still have almost 10 minutes to close the session. So Nacho, Blanca, you might want to give some closing remarks, and we will give the floor to Kristen in the end so that she can have the last intervention, and we will finish with the event, and then I will say goodbye. And I will call you to connect in the last session, so next week. So Nacho, Blanca, I don't know if you want to take the floor. Well, I actually, after this conversation that we have had, I really like to try and connect the things that we do in our day-to-day with those revolutionary acts and political acts that are the creation of new social relationships. So generating mutual support, that is the best strategy, the best way to face uncertainty, the uncertainty that we're submitted to. So as a militant, what really makes me happy is to be in my children's school, my son and my daughter, because the best legacy that I can give them is to create mutual support relationships and different relationships between the families in the school, which are not that are not politicized families. And if we create a social network that is positive, that is healthy, that is that of support, any uncertainty that we have in the future will be easier dealt with. I mean, it will be easier to deal with them. So that's the idea that I take home, and that bottle of wine, that walk with our friends as a political act. So I'm going to take that home, and that feeling as well of the fact that we must not forget about our everyday revolutionary acts, and we mustn't disconnect it from a greater political strategy. So that need of, I mean, it's not because we have to build it, but we have to think about larger scale ideas. For instance, I am in my house, which is different, and with that mutual support that's enough. I mean, I'm happy thanks to that, but we also have to think about propagating that idea. That could be the first step for the transformation of a model, and the next steps that we will be taking will be in that same direction. So it will not be random, it will be targeted. And I think that is also important. So we have to have those two visions, the things that are closer to home, and then the ones that are prospections or things that we want for the future. And not everyone has to have those two visions, but we need to at least have a door open to that happening. And that is the message that I take home. And thank you so much. It was a pleasure to be with Kristen and to meet Blanca again. So thank you so much for this opportunity. Okay. Well, I would like to close with the challenges, because since now we have finished on a positive note, I would like to just give us some homework for the future. I think that we have lots of utopian experiences the world over, and it's wonderful to learn from those experiences, and they have to take us to challenges so that it is not just something sectorial, so that we can scale it up. And I was thinking, when I was thinking about this debate, that was actually the first point that I wrote about, or the first point that I thought about, which was the importance of our utopian projects to have internal democracy. There need to be democratic, with a gender perspective, with a class perspective. And I was thinking about external threats from the legal standpoint. For instance, right now we have the housing movement is very strong in Spain, but actually one of the problems that we are having right now is the repression, the police repression and the political repression that we're facing, and how that can be something that discourages people. And that is something that has happened during the last decade. It happened with the anarchist movement and the independence movement in Catalonia as well. Then the internal threats, such as economic sustainability of the projects, and the lack of participation, the lack of motivation, and I'm taking home that comment that you made, Kristen, of the fact that the assembly needs to be joyful in and of itself as well. There needs to be some immediate joy in the assembly, because otherwise it's just too boring. And you're absolutely right. We have to think about what creates joy immediately, not just for the future, but also in the immediate moment. I think that political projects and utopias have to have clear objectives and clear strategies, because otherwise we will try to touch everything, and nobody can solve all of the injustices in the world. It's impossible to do it all. So we have to think about a small part and then connect it to some other part, and to focus our energies in just one topic so that we don't have so much burden on our shoulders. And we also have to think about the context, because what happens in the US is very different to what is happening in Spain, to what happens in Latin America, or what happens in Asia. So we can learn obviously from their experiences, but we mustn't try to replicate exactly everything that has been done in other places, because it's not practical. And then what I was saying previously about transferring from the everyday to the structural, and from the structural to the everyday reality. And I do think that it is possible. And also this idea that Kristen was also touching upon, which I completely share, which is the fact that utopia is a horizon. It's a process. So we're always in utopian processes. It's not really projects, but processes, because it's never perfect. These are unfinished projects that can always be improved. So it's always utopian processes, not really perfect things. So it doesn't need to fit with everyone and for everyone. And thank you so much, Kristen.
Thank you so much for your interventions and comments. It has been such a wonderful pleasure, and it's such a joyous experience to have this conversation and to share these ideas. I think you're right. Like, the situation in the United States, I mean, the thing that's been really interesting to me, I'll just end on this, right, is you've seen the Spanish cover, but to me, one of the funniest things are the ways the different countries have interpreted my book. And they've changed the cover, and they've often changed the subtitle. So this is the American cover, which is like very happy and bright colors. You know, it's a very almost like a self-help book. But then the British, they completely changed the cover, and I don't know if you can see it very well, but it's sort of like a woman and a baby, and they changed the subtitle. The subtitle in Britain is "In Praise of Radical Alternatives to the Traditional Family Home," whereas I think that the American subtitle is the same as the Spanish one, which is what 2,000 years of wild experiments can teach us about the good life. But then the Germans, and the Germans are not always excitable about hope or optimism or utopia, but the German version is very different, right? It's very boring. It's a very simple cover. And they changed the title to A Short History of Radical Alternatives to Patriarchy. So they completely told a different story about what the book was about. It's not about living the good life. It's about resisting patriarchy. And then the Dutch cover is much more of like an urban sort of like, this is the world we live in, and somehow we're going to end up in heaven, So I think that this question of context is really important. And to close, I just want to say that it's not only the national context that matters, right? It's also your local and community context. It's also the generation that you might be a part of. It might be the political outlook that you have. Every utopia has to be like, I think the point of utopia is to be flexible. It's that wonderful quote by Eduardo Galeano, right? That utopia is always on the horizon. If you walk 10 steps towards it, it moves 10 steps away. If you move closer to it, it continues to move away. So he says, what is the point of utopia? The point is to keep walking. And I think that's the message that we all have to have, is that the point of utopia is not to arrive anywhere, but it's to believe that the future is something that we individually and collectively make together. And that since we make it, we can make it better than it is today. Thank you.
Pues nada, hasta aquí hemos llegado.
Well, that was it. Thank you. Thank you, Nacho. Thank you, Blanca. Thank you especially to Kristen. Thank you, Kristen. Here you have the Spanish cover.
Spanish cover. I don't have one yet.
And I think that neuroscience has also discovered recently that memory and imagination are in the same areas of our brain. So I think that Kristen's book also makes that exercise of memory, of of projection, of imagination. So I'm inviting you to dig deeper into this dialogue through reading as well. And I wanted to thank those who well, Matilde for the translation, and she has been congratulated on the chat as well. So apparently people were thankful for the translation, because we were speaking very, very fast, all of us, and they appreciated your work. So I would like to close by inviting you on Wednesday to the last session of this cycle, which is called Digital Utopias, and we will talk about futures where we could maybe integrate the different dimensions, the ecological dimensions of the technological reality that we currently have, and how it should be transformed in the digital ecosystem so that it is viable and it can coexist with a society that has gotten to the point where there is ecological fairness. So trying to imagine other technological realities that might help us face the challenge. And an eco-social transition does not necessarily mean for internet to disappear. So we could have a different screen regime, we would have different hardwares and softwares, but we might have to collectively think about that reality, which we very often leave outside of the debate. So that's the invitation I wanted to extend to you all. So thank you all very much.